special note before we get started with the reading of this story here. Now, I typically like fiction work, but there are life experiences that attribute into what I write, how I write. And this is actually a short story that is based on a real life experience that I have had that I recently shared with a young family member. And there's parts of this story that I didn't technically include, I think because I didn't want to scare him. But then also, because it's for a class project. But there's actually an important piece from this to know that, there's some things that are just not for you in a good way. So let's get started. Thank you for joining me for Story Time with Tanya. And the title of this story is called A Distant Memory. It truly started out like every other day, except I was running late for work. Train service was slow, and my train had stopped in the tunnel before my train stopped. Even though I knew it was going to make me even later, I stopped at my usual coffee spot. The news was airing footage of a plane's damage to a building at the World Trade Center. And as I waited for my order, I asked what was going on. This is when I was told that a plane had hit Building 1. At the time, I worked in a building in Midtown on the 34th floor where we had a beautiful view of the World Trade Center. When I got to work, as I walked down the corridor, I could see what looked like a large fire in the second tower. As I passed my coworkers, the confusion, fear, and worry was pretty visible on everyone's face. By the time we understood it was a terrorist attack, our managers determined it was safer to stay inside our building. It was hard to focus on work, but I did try to keep busy. But at some point, I started hearing loud gasps. And when I walked out of my office, the first tower was just gone from view. We just couldn't see it anymore. Our building was evacuated shortly after, where a group of us walked home. We were all so scared, not sure what was going to happen next. Train service wasn't safe. We weren't sure if walking the Queensboro Bridge was safe, but it was the only way we could get home. I eventually made it home and turned on the news, where I learned that both buildings had ultimately collapsed from the damage of the planes hitting them. Our family was incredibly blessed to have not lost anyone that day. When you consider how many people were lost, I tear up every time I talk about it because I know how lucky I am to have not been impacted with loss of loved ones stemming from September 11th. I'm also filled with gratefulness because that evening, my 3 childhood friends came over and we stayed up all night just watching the news while trying to comfort each other through a very confusing time for all of us. I get emotional every year. This year was harder because it was the first time I've openly talked about it with my youngest. It's a hard thing to explain, and it's not something someone forgets. And the part that I left out for this story, and for a little bit of context, I shared this experience for my nephew who was having a school project. So I wrote this down. And of course, it was nearing the anniversary of September 11th. And it was different this year because I I was trying to explain more because my youngest had more questions. And what I didn't share was the fact that, when I first got out into the workforce, I did temping, and I received a temp position. It was for a week at Chase, Chase Bank. And I worked so damn hard, so hard. And I was like, I'm going to get this job. I am going to get this job. Now, it wasn't at the bank, it was like an office building. And I just knew I was a shoo-in. And at the end of that week, I didn't get a more permanent position. I was crushed. I was like, why don't they want me? I'm amazing. I follow directions, blah, blah, blah. Um, but I didn't get the job and life moved on. And then fast forward the following year, I did get the job that I was working at the time. But the position that I didn't get was in One World Financial Center. So it wasn't at the Trade Center, it was at the Financial Center, which was right across the street. And if I'm not mistaken, that building ultimately did collapse from the damage of the other falling buildings. So I say all this to say, some things are just not meant for you. That job was not meant for me. That place was not meant for me. And I'm extremely grateful for it. I can't even describe how grateful I am because while we were all on the outside looking in from Midtown, the people that were actually downtown, they've had a very different experience, and if not possibly those who were able to walk away from it. And why I share this is because this was a reminder, this story of me putting this down on paper was actually a reminder of me wanting to work on writing more and sharing that part of myself and letting my the creative side of myself go and be unleashed, if you will. But that short story is based on a true story, and it is my experience that I experienced when I was a very young adult, more than 20 years ago. So thank you for listening to this episode of Storytime with Tanya, and I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for next week for another episode.